Picture this. You're an 8-year-old boy walking through your local seaside arcade. You've just hopped off Mario Kart GP, and you look over to your left and you see this tall cabin on the one side. There's this creepy zombie peering back through the cover, right into your eyes, watching you. To 9-year-old me, this was terrifying, but it drew me in closer. So close that I sat and watched the whole trailer for the gameplay. And after watching that, well, let's just say 8-year-old me would always try to avoid that part of the arcade for many years. A few years later I came back. I was a bit older, I'd say maybe 13, but I still felt different. And I tried, and I died in stage 2. Yeah, not the most epic tale, I admit, but one that will be with me forever. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was my exposure to the arcade classic that is The House of the Dead. Now, over the years, my knowledge of the series has grown, and grown, until today where we can now present The House of the Dead Iceberg. I have broken this iceberg into 7 tiers, starting at the top with the basics of the series. As we descend further down, we'll cover obscure media as well as some creepy details and endings, and once we get to the deep ocean, I have 4 creepy theories for you. As you can see, I have based the themes of each level off the game's food chain as I see it. Before we hop in, I do want to say a massive thank you to the guys over at the Wiki of the Dead, both the website for all the info and the things that it taught me, also to those on their official Discord that helped me out. If you're a big fan of this series, go check them out. I will leave a link to their Discord in the description of this video, because honestly, they rival my love for the series and mine is uncontained. But with all of that said, strap in, drop in those quarters into the arcade cabinet as we begin to tackle The House of the Dead Iceberg. The 1998 Curian case is basically where this whole series began. This is just a name used in game when a character wants to talk about what happened in the House of the Dead 1. This being in December of 1998, Curian tried weaponizing his creatures to destroy humanity. That's all there really is to this entry. It's just basically when characters talk about it in this way, they're referring to House of the Dead 1. So yeah, this is just quite a brief entry. The AMS was a government agency responsible for worldwide criminal investigation. Many of the main cast of the series are working under the AMS, and all of them being agents, with one of them being the highest ranking, which was Thomas Rogan, one of the first playable characters throughout the series, as well as who you rescue in House of the Dead 3. Not really much is known about the AMS, but they are very much your stereotypical government agency that just saves the world. But they're basically the good guys of the entire series. Well, I really don't want to talk about this one, but I guess I'm going to have to talk about this piece of shit somewhere. Directed by Uwe Boll, this film has literally nothing to do with the original games. There is no clever style or tonnage, it's terribly made, and the only thing that actually ties it back to the original games is the reveal that one of the main characters is actually Dr. Curian. And no, I don't care that I spoiled this piece of shit film, it's not worth watching, so trust me, I'm doing you a favour. The DBR Corporation is an organisation that conducted genetic research and experimentation. Well, that was a mouthful, and it rhymed. And was headed by the big man himself, Dr. Curian, and was funded by the man with the world's best laugh. Caleb Goldman. These guys are basically behind what happened throughout the entirety of the series, and especially the creation of all the creatures in the facility seen in House of the Dead 3. They consist of many scientists who were sadly turned on by Curian when he released his creations back at the mansion in the first game. Oddly enough, the House of Dead's representation in the Sonic and Sega series is very weird in the fact that they don't actually address them as the House of the Dead levels, but instead as the Curian Mansion levels. Guess Sega gotta make sure that E for Everyone rating stays on the kart racer. Still, even then, the characters they chose to represent this series in the racing games aren't even from the mainline game series. but we'll come back to Zombie-O and Zombie-Co later. As for the tracks and the music, I would say they completely nailed it. The music is amazing, they picked a lot of the fast-paced, really good tracks. And also, I like how you can find hidden bosses in the races, like both Tower and Hangman are hidden in them, which is really cool. Due to the time of its release, as well as Mortal Kombat being released 4 years prior, and being known for its super heavy violence, House of the Dead caught the attention of the ESRB ratings board as well as the wider video game censorship board very quickly. The original was given the ability to toggle green blood instead of red, and then following the tragic Kobe child murders of March in 1997, the game's base settings were set to green blood. This was across the board for the entire series in the arcades, as well as during the release of the Sega Saturn port. Even so, after 3 games, the games became more and more censored, leading to the point where we are now with Scarlet Dawn, where there nearly isn't as much blood and gore. Which is the shame if you ask me, because one of the main enjoyments of this series was blowing half the chunk off a zombie while we watched it fall to the ground, like you could do in the older games. These two are some of the most popular spin-offs from the series, whereas Pinball isn't as well known. Typing is simply known for how ridiculous it was. And instead of using guns in this game, you would type out on your keyboard with a PC strapped to your back, and the sentences you would type would damage the zombies. An interesting fact I found out about typing was that it actually started out as an arcade release. I'm not gonna lie to you, if I was given this instead of a textbook when I had to do GCSE English, my grades would have been a lot higher. Still, despite being a spin-off, these are so well known that they couldn't really go anywhere lower on this list. This is one of the most important things on this entire tier list. This is the whole reason House of the Dead exists today. Back in the early 1990s, Sega released Virtua Cop, an arcade shooter developed by Sega's AM2 Studios, and was designed by Yui Suzuki, who was like the Miyamoto of Sega at the time. This game was very stylistic and different from many other arcade shooters, as it prioritized accuracy and making your shots count, as the camera would zoom in on who you needed to shoot. At the time, Sega was encouraging friendly competition within its development studios, and so AM1 stepped up to the plate. AM1 came out with the House of the Dead, which oddly enough was made using the Virtua Cop engine. If you wish to know more, I shall leave a video that covers the whole series' history in more detail. If not, I might make one myself in the future, but for now, shall we move on? Gary is a bit of an anomaly within the House of the Dead series. He only appears and is spoken about within House of the Dead 2, and then is never spoken of again as if he never existed. He also proposes some interesting quotes. For starters, he arguably has the best voice in the entire game, acting wise, not like there was much competition. And he also questions what him and James did at the end of the game, saying that he didn't even know if it was right, and seems as if he would have agreed with Goldman and that humanity was growing at such a rapid rate that it couldn't be sustained. Overall, Gary is such an interesting minor character that had little character, and I wish more was done with him like with G, but instead he was simply forgotten about. Besides the flashbacks, including him in House of the Dead 4. House of the Dead is a game series that if you were to play all the games in order, you wouldn't be playing them in chronological order. Instead, the timeline starts with the first game. Technically it would start with Overkill, but then go on to the original, followed by 2, then 4, then Scarlet Dawn, and then ending with 3. I plan at a much later date to cover the entire story of these games, but until then I recommend going down to the wiki as they have all of the answers to your questions. But to save time, I'll show the timeline on screen here so you can get a gist. and see what I'm on about, but for the sake of this video, we are going to have to move on. This is the title of the newer version of House of the Dead 4 that was released back in 2006. Now, I had originally thought this was just some extra DLC for the PS3 version of the game, but it turns out that this version of the game was no simple add-on. It was a separate game with a completely separate base mechanics. You see, House of the Dead 4 Special was built with the same kind of gunplay as Sega's Let's Go Island, where two players would sit in a booth together. Things were changed, such instead of using individual life points, like all the previous titles, the two players would have a shared life bar, and then would be graded on their teamwork as a couple, again sharing many similarities with Let's Go Island. Within Special, you would tackle both Justice and a guest star appearance from the Magician, and would have two separate endings based on how well you performed in the final boss, as well as a secret ending if you scored high enough. As a kid growing up, I had to make all of my pound coins count, so I would tend to play House of the Dead the most, as I could stretch out my credits on these games to make the most bang for my buck. But even yet, despite that, I had no idea for the longest time that these games had different endings based around your performance within each game. The problems with some of these endings is that they're canonical sometimes, and sometimes they're not, so it's hard to kind of tell which ending holds more truth. But in the end, a neat gameplay feature to push you again so you can see the secret endings and get a better high score. Some of my personal favourites include the ending involving G during House of the Dead 4, not Special, the original one where it actually uses his House of the Dead 3 sprite, as well as the one with the mysterious man in House of the Dead 3, keying us into there being more going on and more involved in the story. At the start of the series, the player is left to believe that the main reason Kyrian is motivated to create the genome sequence isn't very clear besides population control, but after playing through the House of the Dead and watching each cutscene at the start of each chapter, it is shown that Kyrian was developing a cure for his terminally ill son Daniel, and within said research, Kyrian was driven mad to the point where he released his creations upon the world, these cutscenes of course being in House of the Dead 3. Around the same time his father's death, Daniel was cured thanks to his father's research. After the Kyrian incident, Daniel went on to watch his father transform, growing into the Wheel of Fate, eventually devouring his father's past actions and helping destroy him in an attempt to save humanity, at the end of the House of the Dead 3. As I talked about previously, Overkill is the canonical starting point of the House of the Dead timeline as far as the games are concerned, and is one of Agent G's first missions where he worked alongside local officer Isaac Washington as they deal with a mutant outbreak in the small town of Bayou City. The massive thing about this game is its canonicity. It's kind of questionable due to how low involvement director Takashi Oda had with the game, whereas the marketing for the game tries to heavily point out that it's a sequel to the original series. Overkill did get a HD remaster in the form of the extended cut on the PS3 back in 2011, as well as a janky mobile release in the form of the House of the Dead Overkill, The Lost Reels. Personally, I've never played any of the Overkill titles, but from what I've seen, it's the same railgun shooting mechanics we all love, so if you can find a copy, I'd say give it a try. Bonus items are a mechanic hidden throughout the entire of the House of the Dead series. They tend to be hidden with indestructible objects within the environment, such as crates and barrels and the like. This will tend to either give you extra score, and in some instances even taking away your score, or if you're extra lucky, it will give you an extra life or a hit point. These are mostly sought out by more experienced players looking to boost their end score, or sometimes used by speedrunners to store lives so they can focus on damage during boss fights instead of trying to prevent damage. The object you can find a range of coins, to mushrooms, even golden frogs or mini magicians, which are kinda cute. But if you play these games, I highly recommend hunting for them because you never know where an extra hit point might come in handy. Quick aside from the video before we get straight back into things, if you like House of the Dead content, please subscribe to this channel. I'm planning on making so much more. I have so many ideas on what to do with this series. If you have any ideas, please comment in the description below. If you simply like House of the Dead content, please comment that as well. And the best thing you can do, show support, is also to like these videos and, like I said, comment to show how much you're enjoying them. And if you're new, subscribe, and heck, even hit the bell if you can. I don't know if you can for this channel or not. But in the meantime, shall we continue? This is something that people who don't have much knowledge of the series won't know about. The zombies in the games are actually clones, which is why many of them look exactly the same, despite all being on the same screen. This is an amazing idea from both a lore and a gameplay perspective, as not only does it give a good reason as to why such a self-contained outbreak can be filled with so many zombies that look exactly the same, it also saves on development time and cost due to the devs only needing to make so many zombie models. Another part to this is that all of the zombies, because they are clones, all share the same names, split into types obviously. So as you saw, we had Neil, who was the mascot for level 1, as we'll put it, as well as the classic Johnny with his axes and stones. Bruce, who is my personal favourite, who I do think should have been called Slash, but we'll leave it there. And I love these names because it gives just a bit of character to these guys, even when they're so generic, and given that you've literally just blown their head off. Hardy is a lot like Gary, as he appears in House of the Dead 2, but then afterwards is never spoken about or referenced again throughout the rest of the entire series. But unlike Gary, Hardy here has a very unexpected and kind of creepy character. Let me explain. In his biography, it states that information regarding Harry remains obscure, both secretive and mysterious. He remains an enigma among other AMS agents. He has been described as gloomy and expressionless and refuses to divulge into his past. This is all we have to know about Harry, as such little is given away about his character, and the stuff we are told is so vague that all we can do is speculate for now. Here's to hoping we can get more information in the House of the Dead 2 remaster. Another character, here's the one that's a little less obscure, but still we have many questions about him. G is basically one of the most important and popular characters in the series, and to this day is the character with the most playable appearances, but even with that we know very little about him, and this is intentional, as it was said that G was given his name to give him a mysterious nature, and you can see from where he is on this iceberg, that's worked. In the end, G still has us asking the same question.
You ever going to tell anyone what that fucking G stands for? No.
Now this one I had no idea about until some guys over at the wikis pointed this out to me, but it turns out back in the year 2000, Palisades Toys announced they'd be selling a series of collectible action figures based around the main bosses and creatures of the House of the Dead 2. There was also a planned second series, but that was sadly cancelled due to poor sales, which sucks because these look so cool. These are some really nice designs, and it was clear that there was attention and detail put into this, and it is very sad that they didn't get a second line of toys. A thing mostly known by those in the community and anyone you talk to about these games, all of the bosses within this game series get their names from tarot cards. Now, some do match up with name and design, such as the lovers being a pair of tarantulas that are together. Some don't really match up, like how I think it would have been better if Justice would have been the name given to Death, and Death would have been given the name to Justice. I do like this detail though, as it builds a little bit of mystery and character to the bosses, making you question whether they were built based around the tarot cards, or if there are even tarot cards in this universe, or some other questions. Still, we might get a little more growth out of these bosses, and it might grow to represent their tarot cards more. But for the time being, there is something very interesting. There's only one card we haven't seen in the series, and that card is the Devil. This is a very strange one. There are two main cases of Goldman becoming a zombie slash a creature. The first time being in House of the Dead 2 and its bad ending, where after reaching the bottom of the Goldman's headquarters, James and Gary bump into a zombie Goldman who then attempts to attack them before a gunshot is heard. We then see that zombie Goldman again appears in the bad ending of House of the Dead 4, where Goldman does his speech about humanity being saved as he turns to the camera, then zooming in on his face, showing his blood red eyes that glow, as well as his disfigured face. These two endings show that the developers are toying with the idea of a zombie Goldman, but have yet found a way to put it into the game, possibly? I mean, who knows? Maybe we finally might get that devil card. Back when House of the Dead 3 was in production, it was being made primarily for Microsoft's new console at the time, the Xbox. The design of the House of the Dead 3 was incredibly different to what we finally got. You see, the original game was actually intended to be cel shaded, but due to bad test reception from the audiences, this was then changed to the more realistic slash cartoony style that we have, which I'm very glad about, because when it comes to style, I really do think that House of Dead 3 is one of the best looking games in the series, given the time that it came out for. And, you know, I wouldn't have minded maybe like a cool little game mode that turned the game cel shaded, not completely, but like stylistically. But I admit, I don't think the cel shading would have worked very well with how gritty and gory 3 became in the end. This is a lot like the case with Zombie Goldman, whereas in House of the Dead there is an ending where Daniel is seen losing his mind and becoming a zombie before attacking Lisa as she screams. This ending basically comes with a whole new batch of implications, that Daniel is something more than just a human being, that he's this sinister monster that hides underneath the surface. And that Daniel, you know, could possibly be like this ticking time bomb that Curian's created ready to set off and start an outbreak all over again. Unfortunately, we don't really get any more answers to these questions, given the fact that House of the Dead 3 is the latest in the series, and that we haven't seen Daniel since House of the Dead 3. So hopefully when that next game gets released, we can finally get some answers. This is one of those really obscure versions of the game, and it's an obscure version of the original title for a change. It's super low quality, very crappy, but all for all, it is a good interpretation of the solid arcade classic. The only thing that makes me question this is that why don't we get a version of the original games for the smartphones, given the fact that smartphones are a lot more powerful now, and you could simply just have it like the Lost Reels where you tap on zombie heads to kill them. Just a thought for the future. Yes, there was a second movie made about House of the Dead. Yes, it was just as horrible as the first, and yes, it was a poor representation of the source material. But for some reason, they planned to make a third film, and it was cancelled. Gee, I couldn't imagine why. Still, honestly, I have a few ideas kicking around on what the House of the Dead movie could be, so I shall leave that for another time. Heck, I might even leave it for another video in the future. This entry is referring to the fact that the original source code for both the first game and the source code for the second were lost due to a reason that I'm yet to find out. If anyone actually knows why, please post it in the comments. I shall pin said comment and then people can refer to that one as to why. But yes, the source code for the original House of the Dead game was lost to time, which is why it's made it so hard for them to make the remaster that they're going through. But surprisingly, they're still doing a very solid job from what I've seen of the advertisements. Now we come to the most obscure of obscure characters, Thornheart. Yeah, that's his name. No idea whether that's the first or last, that's just his name. Is probably the biggest bad guy throughout the whole series, and is the man behind... Nope, fuck off! Out of the video! No. What I was trying to say was, Thornheart is basically above Curian and Goldman, and is the head of the corporation that they run at this point. and is the main bad guy of the entire series. For a man with such an importance to the whole series, we know such little about him. The main thing we know is that he suffered from a rare disease, and in the end had the idea that humanity needed to evolve after surviving it. This guy started out as just the mysterious figure when he made his first appearance in House of the Dead 3, and afterwards, and slowly but surely, becoming more apparent as the series progressed, eventually being at the forefront of Scarlet Dawn and finally getting his name revealed. The only problem has been is that they've changed his sprite 3 times now, so it's a bit weird, but still it's been confirmed that these are all Thornheart. As for the moment in time, we can only sit and wait to see what Thornheart has left in store, as he did get away at the end of Scarlet Dawn. Who knows, maybe even we'll find that the devil was in disguise the whole time. These 2 games are the more lesser known versions of Typing of the Dead. Typing of the Dead is 2 is House of the Dead 3, but with Typing of the Dead gameplay thrown over it. And English of the Dead was a Nintendo DS port of the House of the Dead 2, but instead of typing, you would have to write out the letters for the words you would have to spell. Now, I would have sucked at this game given my dyslexia, and probably would have failed horribly at English especially, but these games look alright. Still not as fun with the gunplay as the original, but solid entries I suppose. This is a very strange little side game that was put in the House of the Dead 3, as well as the port of House of the Dead 2 and 3 Returns. The side mode would have has the player split off from Lisa and G and go into an elevator that would take them back in time to the year 2000 to play as James and Gary in House of the Dead 2. Now, as far as I can tell, this is not canon and is simply a gameplay thing, giving the players the chance to unlock as many cosmetic and gameplay changes in the House of the Dead's original mode. But looking back on it, I feel like they could have done a lot more with this idea, especially like for the plot, as it could have been used as a gameplay mechanic or even a plot point. Maybe in a later video I'll discuss the possibilities of this, but for the time being, it's a wasted potential in my opinion. In the year 2000, the state of Indianapolis had its mayor, Bart Peterson, sign a law banning minors from playing coin-operated video games with graphic violence or sexual content, unless accompanied by a parent or an adult guardian. A fine of £200 per day could have been assigned to non-complying arcades, and their licenses could be revoked after 3 violations. Within a 1-year period, the video game industry was expected to follow these regulations. This is just kind of another typical thing to come out of the early 2000s and late 90s, of video games essentially being censored, which, depending on your viewpoint, could be a good or a bad thing. Sega's Golden Gun and Vampire Knight are tied to House of the Dead due to how they were both published by Sega's AM1 Studios, like House of the Dead was. But they also share similar aspects with some of the other House of the Dead titles. For an example, Vampire Knight was heavily compared to House of the Dead 2 upon its release, as well as adding in the attack gauge showing the player how much health the boss attack had and letting the player know how close it had come to stopping the boss attack, which was then an aspect that was added to House of the Dead 3. As for Golden Gun, it used the exact same engine and some of the assets from House of the Dead 4, as well as it shared a similar chapter structure to both House of the Dead 3 and Scarlet Dawn. These games are very solid arcade titles. I wouldn't prefer them over the original series, but if you can find a cabinet floating about somewhere, I'd say put a couple of quid in and have a go and see what you think yourself. Okay, a very quick and obscure entry. Now this was just silly. Darts of the Dead was a game available on the Darts Live 2 arcade machines from October the 2nd to the 31st in 2017. It was a spin-off of the House of the Dead series, recycling basically visual assets from both 1 and House of the Dead 3, and that's really all there is for this game. There's no in-depth anything, it's just a spin-off that kind of went nowhere and was just weird. House of the Dead 1 had a lost beta that was supposedly just lost to time. Said beta features much more violent game content and was basically just a lot more messed up than the original. Unfortunately, my main source for this is another Iceberg video that I found by a Spanish YouTuber, Omega Delphix26, so I will leave a link to that video if you wish to find out where I got this from. Go check it out though, it is a very solid video. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, so the autocorrect subtitles are about as good as it gets for me. Some aspects include Scrap Sophie boss for House of the Dead 2, which I'll talk a little bit about later. This entry is about the vinyl discs that were released which contain the House of the Dead soundtrack. This was done by a company called Cartridge Thunder, also responsible for bringing both Metal Slug and Ninja Gaiden soundtrack to vinyls as well. They released both tracks of House of the Dead 1 and 2 on vinyl. Personally, I think this is so cool because they have some really amazing soundtracks, as well as the one thing that stands out to me the most is the incredible artwork. This is amazing. It's so detailed and well designed and really just amazingly drawn. And honestly, I just want the vinyls simply for the artwork alone. But you know, the soundtracks are cool. But overall, I do think these are really cool, and if you can get your hands on them, do so. They're incredible. I have nothing else to say. For this one, I couldn't find much, but I remember hearing somewhere or reading somewhere there being a cut boss for House of the Dead 2, which was a zombified corpse of Sophie from the first game. This would have been kind of cool and interesting, kind of playing off the dynamic of the relationship between G and Harry that Sophie had, and how that made things difficult between them and how it would have been a struggle to, you know, kill her. But given how we didn't play as them in the second game, and now, as of House of the Dead 3, Lisa being the child of Sophie and Thomas exists, this would have created some kind of time paradox, but obviously that wouldn't have been thought of at the time. I honestly think it would have been an interesting idea, but that, as like a lot of things with the older games, is now unfortunately just lost to the test of time. The House of the Dead EX, also known in Europe as The Loving Dead (parentheses The House of the Dead EX), was a spin-off from the mainline House of the Dead series. This was exclusively released in Japanese arcades back in 2009, and the story is about a young zombie couple, Zombio and Zombiko, who seek to escape Dr. Curien. This is because Zombiko is a clone of Curien's ex-wife and his first love that Curien tries to bring back from the dead, but unfortunately has to lock her away due to her unruly nature, where Zombio is placed in charge of guarding her. Eventually they fall in love, they break captivity, and eventually try to escape from Curien's grasp. Funnily enough, this game draws a lot from House of the Dead 4 in its bosses by taking them and turning them into minigames. It's also just a massive minigame collection along with railgun shooter elements, and personally, it's just really fucking weird. But if you can somehow find this, I'd say give it a shot. I mean, how bad can it really be? Zombies Revenge was a horror-themed beat-em-up based in the universe of the House of the Dead series. It was released by Sega in the arcades back in the year 1999. Now, the plot of this game follows 3 AMS agents, Stick, Linda, and Rikia, I believe that's how it's pronounced. I apologise if I butchered it, as they navigate a zombie-infested woodside city, chasing down the main bad guy who goes by the name Zed, as he controls an undead soldier. Basically, this game was released to mediocre to mixed reviews due to its short length, and the main ties it has to the series is due to one of the stages being set outside the Curien mansion, and the final boss of the game being a darker, winged version of the Magician. Besides that, there isn't really too much about this game to know, as its canonicity is questioned, and even if it was, it doesn't have much of an impact on the original House of the Dead story. Produced by Gamist Comics, Nightmare Syndrome is a manga book series based around the story of the first House of the Dead game. It begins with Thomas and Rogan and G entering the Curien mansion and shooting the monkey creatures that can normally be found in that part of the stage. If this ever gets translated, I could do some kind of dramatic reading, but for now, there will be a link where you can find the scanned version of this manga. Personally, I find this so cool, and to get a more narrative and in-depth approach to the first game's event, I really want this to happen more with the later games in the series, so we can help push these characters into characters and past the really bad cheesy dubbing. But for now, I'll enjoy it for what it is, and that is a really cool manga. House of the Dead Nightmare is a top-down mobile game developed by Sega. You play as Thomas Rogan, and like in the first House of the Dead game, you shoot your way through the Kyrian mansion. But G is absent, and Rogan moves through the world on a predetermined path. The player can only control his aim, with Rogan firing automatically when an enemy or a destructible object is in his line of fire. I mean, this just feels like House of the Dead 1 minus the fun gun combat, which made the, whole game series enjoyable in the first place. So this isn't really my cup of tea. I really enjoy the immersion of the main game series and its gunplay, but if you can find it somehow, let me know, because I couldn't seem to find it on the Play Store anywhere. But if you can find it and pick it up, I'd say it's a solid game and give it a shot. In the House of the Dead 3's Perfect Guide, Amy is intrinsically linked to Caleb Goldman in the tree diagram. Their relationship in the manual is described as hostile. This proposes many questions, as Amy's link to Goldman must be more personal and important than the other characters of the second game in order for her to be the only one with a direct link to him. Whether that link is via family or friends or personal connections, we have no idea. I'm just hoping that this isn't some kind of cop-out to do with the phone call she gets from Goldman in the second game. Even then, how would Goldman have the private number of an AMS agent? It makes you think, don't it? Another short, obscure one, but in the early days of the House of the Dead's IP being passed around film studios, the second company to come across the rights was actually DreamWorks. Yeah, that DreamWorks Studios. I could have imaged this as being quite an interesting animated House of the Dead film, or heck, even a TV series, but unfortunately we all know where the rights ended up in the end, and I don't want to keep talking about it, so moving on. There are some connections between both Star and the Magician. It begins with their numbers in the PDA. Star is labelled as 0001, whereas of course Magician is number 0, so I want you to hold on to this detail as we go a bit more in depth. Now, they both share similar body types, they are both mostly humanoid creatures, and they share similar energy projectile based attacks, as well as the ability of flight in very similar ways, of simply that they levitate. Now, they also have very similar designs and attacks, and I have reason to believe that this creation, that Goldman or Kyrian or whoever made the Star, took a similar approach that they did when they made the Magician. Now, given how close their numbers are in the PDA, I'm led to believe that after Magician's rebellion and the murder of Kyrian, Goldman decided to clone and improve upon the Magician, making the number 1, an almost flawless recreation of Magician minus the rebellion. Although an interesting theory, there isn't much else truly to back this up. I just found it very interesting that they had some similar coincidences and connections. During House of the Dead 4's bad ending, Goldman is seen talking about how the human race has not yet been eliminated. Given the fact that said video of Goldman would have had to have been recorded before his demise in the year 2000, this means he must have known somehow that his plans in both House of the Dead 2 and his plan to nuke the planet in House of the Dead 4 would have failed. Given how Goldman has shown signs of being more than just a mere man, it does make you consider that this devil card that we haven't seen yet in the games might be waiting behind one of the series' main antagonists since the very start.
There is no way to avoid your fate, James.
Can't beat him. We must close Pandora's box now or never.
James! What are
This is our last hope. This will stop it. Kate, don't give up.
This one is about a secret ending that you can get in The Living Deads if you achieve an S rank across the game series, where Star is then shown taking off his mask, revealing that he has Curion's face and that it's been Curion in disguise. Now, one of the guys on the wiki pointed this out to me because I'd never played The Living Deads before, so shout out to this guy, Magician for Smash, who I'm very grateful for. Another factor that we both talked about was the fact that in some instances of Star, when you damage him and his cloak comes off his head, he begins to actually look like Curion slightly. And given the fact that the Wheel of Fate exists, we know that Curion is no stranger to messing around with his genetic material, so a clone of himself doesn't actually seem that far-fetched. Much like the Star and the Magician, the Moon and the World are remarkably similar in the sense that they both are large humanoid creatures that progressively evolve throughout their fight. Their fights are similar in structure as well, given the fact that both James and Ryan both throw themselves into the monster to ultimately kill it. Although Ryan does survive the endeavour, it is set up at first to believe that Ryan has perished in the same vein as his brother. It's almost like history repeating itself. I know this entry is weird and a little bit out there, but I couldn't help but notice the similarities and creepy coincidences between both these bosses in structure and design in my most recent playthrough of Scarlet Dawn. So I just thought I'd put this out there as a bit of food for thought. And to end it off, we have the idea that even after all the fighting and countless deaths, in the end the AMS agency lost, leading to a world ravaged by the dead. And this is what we see in House of the Dead 3. Given how House of the Dead 3 takes place in the latest point within the timeline, and how the world surrounding the EFI facility is just a wasteland, as well as the building itself being surrounded by rubble, it makes you really think that yeah, the world has failed and everything is lost. Also, the facility is labelled as the source of humanity's downfall, so at this point in the series, it does seem like humanity is lost. But luckily, even after all of this, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that is in the form of Daniel and Lisa, who stopped the Wheel of Fate. And hopefully, starting a better tomorrow. That being dependent on which ending is actually canon. For all we know, Daniel turned and the world is doomed. Or they got out and a better tomorrow can start. As for now, we can just sit and wait. And hopefully, we'll get our answers soon within the next House of the Dead title. Okay, so that's going to do it today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this Iceberg video. It's a bit out there, it's a bit different, it's not my usual style, but I really wanted to make this as it covers a game series that I'm really passionate about, and it gives me a chance to kind of talk about all of the stuff in the series that I've come to learn and know. I understand this video is quite long and it's a bit longer than my usual style, but I do hope you all enjoyed it. I did kind of see this video more as a listening experience, so I hope you guys had a lot of fun. The script at this point is now approaching 6,000 words, so at this point in time it is my longest scripted video, so I could really appreciate any support that you guys are willing to show on this. So if you could just like the video, because it's taken a long time to get around to finishing it. Also, if you're new and you like what you see, I am planning to cover more House of the Dead in the future, so if you want to subscribe, by all means do so. I'll be bringing much more House of the Dead content along with the Dead by Daylight stuff throughout the next year. But this has been the Ginger Gamer, and as always, I will see you in the next one.